"Mr. Harris, you are charged with theft," the judge said, his voice monotone. "How do you plead?" John lifted his head slowly. His eyes met the judge's, and for the first time in years he felt something stir within him, resentment, anger, but mostly an overwhelming sense of having been wronged by the very country that had once honored him. "Guilty, Your Honor." John said quietly but firmly, "I was hungry." John Harris had lived on the streets of Easton, a small, quiet town in Pennsylvania, for nearly a decade. At 66, he was a fixture in the community, though one largely ignored. His once broad shoulders had shrunk with age, and his weathered face, framed by a salt and pepper beard, carried the weight of a past full of sacrifice and regret. His eyes, though distant, held stories no one bothered to ask about. His movements were slow but purposeful, like a man accustomed to both survival and invisibility. A military-grade backpack, faded and worn, was slung across his back, once a badge of pride, now nothing more than a lifeline. John's daily routine was simple. He scoured the streets for recyclables, took whatever scraps of food the town's diners would offer, and slept in the alleyways, careful not to stay in one place for too long. To the world he was just another homeless man, but what they didn't know was that he had once been a sergeant in the U.S. Army, a veteran who had seen the darkest corners of war and emerged with medals of valor. That was before Sarah, his wife, died in 2008. Her death hastened by a misdiagnosis from the Veterans Affairs Hospital. After her passing, John's faith in the system and in the country he had fought for crumbled. He sold their modest home, donated the money to charity, and vanished into the streets. On this particular freezing December morning, with the biting wind cutting through the fabric of his worn jacket, John found himself at the doorstep of Dolan's Corner Market. 3 days without food had left him weak, and his stomach growled loudly in protest. He knew the routine: get in, grab something, and get out. No one had ever really paid attention to him before. As he slipped a loaf of bread into his jacket, the bell above the door jingled, and the store owner, Mr. Dolan, called out from behind the counter, "Hey, stop right there." John froze the bread, now visible in his coat. He knew there was no way to run. He had learned long ago to accept whatever life threw at him. "I just needed something to eat," John said quietly, his voice almost lost in the hum of the store. The younger officer who arrived on the scene, Officer Mark Stevens, placed a hand on John's shoulder. "You're a vet?" he asked, noticing the dog tags hanging from John's neck. John nodded slowly. "I was someone, not anymore." The officer looked uncertain, but the moment passed quickly. The store owner who had called the police watched in silence. John felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him as they let him out. It wasn't the first time he had been caught doing something like this, but this time felt different. The morning sun shone cold over Easton, casting long shadows down the streets as the old courthouse stood tall, a relic of a bygone era. John Harris had never expected to find himself there again, not after the years of silence and self-imposed isolation. But here he was, walking through the heavy doors with a mixture of resignation and confusion. His hands, still rough from years of labor, trembled as they were cuffed behind his back. The courtroom was nearly empty. Aside from a few reporters, a couple of bored-looking attorneys, and the usual court staff, there was no one there to witness John's fate. A single person, his public defender, Clara Reynolds, had met with him briefly the night before. Her indifference had been palpable, a clear sign that John was just another case to clear off the docket. She had barely looked at him before telling him she would try her best. For all she knew, he was just another homeless man caught in the web of bureaucracy. John's mind wandered as he sat in the witness box, his eyes fixed on the floor. His thoughts drifted to the days in Iraq, the long patrols, the nights spent awake with the sound of gunfire in the distance. He had survived all of that. He had survived the war, but somehow he hadn't been able to survive the aftermath. Sarah had died because of the very system he had once fought to protect. The Judge Michael Carmichael, a stern man in his mid-50s, peered over his glasses at the case file in front of him. He didn't look at John directly. The case was simple. A homeless man accused of shoplifting bread. He had seen it 1,000 times before. A small crime in a big city. Just another statistic. Mr. Harris, you are charged with theft, the judge said, his voice monotone. How do you plead? John lifted his head slowly. His eyes met the judge's, and for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him. Resentment, anger, but mostly an overwhelming sense of having been wronged by the very country that had once honored him. Guilty, Your Honor. John said quietly but firmly, I was hungry. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as people glanced at one another. A few whispers could be heard in the back rows, but the judge's eyes were fixed on John, as if trying to make sense of something hidden beneath the surface. Then something unexpected happened. As Judge Carmichael's gaze lingered on John, his eyes seemed to soften just for a moment. He looked back down at the file, then back at John, and for the first time his professional mask cracked. I'm sorry, Mr. Harris, the judge said, his voice losing some of its edge. We'll take a recess. The courtroom fell silent. People began to shuffle in their seats, exchanging confused glances. John didn't move. He didn't speak. He sat feeling the weight of the room pressed down on him, wondering why he was even still here. As the courtroom emptied, John could feel eyes still on him, but it was the look of the judge that haunted him most. Had something about him changed in that moment? Would his life really be different after this trial? The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom closed behind John as he stood alone in the corner. His hand brushed against the cool metal of the chair, his mind racing. For the first time in years, the sense of being seen, really seen, felt strange. He hadn't expected the judge to react like that. It was just a loaf of bread. The world had moved on, and John had been left behind. In the courtroom, whispers still swirled, but for John time seemed to slow, each minute stretching out as he sat in quiet contemplation. He didn't even notice when Clara Reynolds, his public defender, came to sit next to him. Mr. Harris, she said, barely looking at him, the judge has ordered a recess. It's unusual, but it might work in your favor. We need to wait for the next phase of the hearing. John nodded absently, the sound of the courtroom chatter fading into the background. His mind was still stuck in the moment with the judge. Meanwhile, in the judge's chambers, Judge Michael Carmichael sat at his desk, his fingers tapping nervously against the old wood. His gaze fell to the military ID in his hands, a picture of a young man in full military regalia staring back at him. The photo was taken years ago, before the world became more complicated, before the pain and loss had marked him forever. He had only recognized the name when John Harris had said it aloud, Harris. The last name was too familiar. Sergeant John Harris, once a hero in the Iraqi and Afghan operations. But this man sitting across from him now was not the same person. He was worn, broken, a shadow of who he used to be. Yet despite the years and the changes, there was something about him that the judge could not ignore. Judge Carmichael placed the military ID on the desk and pulled up John's service records on the computer. The information quickly filled the screen. Bronze Star recipient. Injured in combat. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Commended for valor. His hand trembled as he scrolled further down, then it hit him like a tidal wave. Saved a fellow officer under enemy fire, carried a wounded medic over 2 miles to safety despite being injured himself. Carmichael sat back, the memories flooding in his own life. Had been saved by Sergeant John Harris in Fallujah, when Carmichael was just a field medic, a young scared man thrust into a war that seemed endless. It was Harris who had pulled him from the burning wreckage, carried him to safety, and kept him alive when everyone else had given up. The courtroom's atmosphere of routine had vanished, replaced by the harsh realization of the man standing in front of him. Judge Carmichael stood up abruptly, pacing around the room. He needed to make a call. A phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Colonel James Mason, I need you to check something for me. Do you remember a Sergeant John Harris from your time in Iraq? The judge asked, his voice thick with emotion. There was a long pause. You found him, haven't you? Mason's voice was low, as if he already knew the answer. I've got him right here in front of me, Mason. He's sitting in my courtroom charged with stealing a loaf of bread. The line fell silent for a moment. Then Mason spoke with quiet disbelief. That man saved my life in Fallujah. He's the reason I'm here today? Carmichael's heart raced as he hung up the phone. The decision was clear. John Harris wasn't just another defendant. He was a hero, forgotten by the very system he had sworn to protect. The courtroom needed to know who he truly was, but was it too late to fix the wrongs done to him? The echo of the gavel rang through the courtroom as Judge Michael Carmichael returned to his seat. The eyes of the room were all focused on him, a sea of curious faces watching his every move. The tension was palpable. No one knew exactly what had happened during the recess, but there was a change in the air. John sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white from the strain. The silence was almost suffocating. Judge Carmichael's expression softened, and he cleared his throat before speaking, addressing both the prosecutor and the audience. Before we proceed with this case, I believe we need to reconsider everything we thought we knew. The prosecutor, Rachel Simmons, looked up from her notes, a flicker of confusion passing over her face. Your Honor, are you suggesting we dismiss the charges? Carmichael's eyes lingered on John for a moment before he answered, Not dismiss. I'm suggesting we take a closer look at who this man truly is. Sergeant John Harris is not a petty thief, and he certainly isn't the homeless man society has labeled him as. The room fell silent again as murmurs started to ripple through the crowd. John glanced up at the judge, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The last thing he expected was for someone to stand up for him, not like this, not in front of so many strangers. As Judge Carmichael continued to speak, he detailed John's military service, his bravery in Iraq, his heroic actions under fire in Fallujah, and his recognition as one of the most outstanding soldiers of his battalion. He spoke of the Bronze Star of the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, and the story of John's valiant rescue of a fellow soldier, Colonel James Mason, the very man who had saved his life. The room was silent as Carmichael described the day they first met in the chaos of battle. I owe my life to this man, Carmichael said, his voice unwavering. But the story doesn't end there. Sergeant Harris has lived in the shadows for far too long, and it's time we bring the truth to light. The tension in the room shifted. Instead of judgmental stares and whispers of disbelief, there was now an overwhelming sense of respect. The prosecutor, visibly flustered, took a step back, allowing the weight of the situation to sink in. John's face remained stoic, but something flickered in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, the smallest hint that maybe, just maybe, there could be redemption in this world for someone like him. At that moment, Clara Reynolds, his public defender, stood up and approached the bench. Your Honor, she began, I think we can all agree that the circumstances have changed. We're no longer talking about just a man stealing bread. We're talking about a man who served this country honorably and whose life has been shattered by an unforgiving system. Mr. Harris, Judge Carmichael said, turning toward him with newfound respect, the court will postpone further proceedings. But I assure you, the world will soon learn who you truly are, and the story of your service will be told not in shame, but with the honor you've earned. John sat back in his chair, the weight of the words sinking in. He had been invisible for so long, cast aside by the system he had once sworn to protect, but now it seemed someone had finally seen him. The days following the courtroom revelation were filled with a mix of emotions for John Harris. As the media swarmed around the courthouse, eager to tell the story of the forgotten hero, John stayed in his modest apartment in Brooklyn. The overwhelming attention was strange to him, even uncomfortable. For years he had lived in the shadows, unseen and unheard. Now he was thrust into the spotlight, and it didn't feel like something he was ready for. Judge Michael Carmichael had done more than simply pause the case he had set in motion. A wave of support and action. Colonel James Mason reached out to John, offering not only his moral support, but also a promise to help him regain the benefits he had been unjustly denied. It was a step in the right direction, but John knew it wouldn't be easy. His trust in the system had been broken, and he wasn't ready to hand over his life to it again. Still, he agreed to meet with Mason at the Veterans Affairs office. The air in the office was thick with bureaucracy and red tape, but Mason, in his usual no-nonsense manner, cut through it all. We're not going to let this stand, John, he said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've earned more than this." As the two men sat across from a disinterested clerk, Mason pulled out a folder filled with documents, John's military records, his commendations, and a long list of reasons why John had been denied his rightful benefits. "This is a clear mistake." Mason said, his fingers tapping the folder. "They never updated the system after your discharge, and now you paid the price for their negligence." John looked at the papers, the realization dawning on him that for over 15 years he had been cheated. The benefits he had earned through sweat, blood, and sacrifice were never paid. The anger inside him flared again, but he pushed it down. It wasn't worth the energy to be angry anymore. What mattered now was what happened next. The next few days were a blur. Media outlets across the country were reporting on John's case, and he found himself thrust into a whirlwind of interviews, phone calls, and more paperwork. It was exhausting, but he couldn't afford to ignore it anymore. This wasn't just about him. It was about all the veterans who had been left behind by the system, forgotten and discarded. Colonel Mason's efforts weren't in vain. Together, they began working on a campaign to highlight the failures of the Veterans Affairs system and demand change. They reached out to Congressman William Larson, who was deeply committed to veterans' rights, and together they planned a public hearing to investigate the systemic issues within VA benefits distribution. As the days passed, John found himself feeling a new sense of purpose, a purpose that wasn't driven by his past, but by a future where veterans would no longer be forgotten. And as he prepared for the public hearing, he realized that he wasn't fighting just for himself anymore. He was fighting for every man and woman who had worn the uniform and been cast aside. The night before the hearing, John stood in front of the mirror in his modest apartment, straightening the collar of his military uniform for the first time in years. The uniform, though worn, felt like a suit of armor. As he looked at his reflection, he thought of the many men and women who had stood beside him in battle, their names lost to time and memory. He was ready, but what would happen? When he walked into that room with all eyes on him, would the system finally acknowledge his service, or would it be another battle he couldn't win? The doorbell rang and John's heart skipped a beat. He knew this was it. The hearing was tomorrow, and everything was about to change. The morning of the hearing arrived quickly, and John Harris felt a nervous excitement stir in his chest as he buttoned up his jacket. The weight of the uniform seemed heavier than it had ever been before. This wasn't just fabric and thread. It was the symbol of years of sacrifice, pain, and dedication. Yet the reality of the moment made it all feel surreal. He was no longer just a forgotten man. He was now a symbol of all the veterans who had been lost to the cracks in the system. The courtroom was filled with tension. Congressman William Larson sat at the front along with a panel of lawmakers and Veterans Affairs representatives. A thick silence hung in the air as John took his seat, his back straight and shoulders squared. He was no longer the man who had wandered the streets of Brooklyn, hidden beneath a veil of grief and neglect. Today he was standing for every person who had fought for their country and had been discarded afterwards. Colonel James Mason sat beside him, offering a silent, supportive presence. John didn't need to look at him to know the weight Mason carried. They were in this together. The room buzzed with the hum of whispered conversations as the hearings began, and John took a deep breath. Congressman Larson opened the session. "This hearing today is not just for Mr. Harris," he said, his voice steady and strong. "It's for all of those who have served, who have been forgotten by the very system they fought to protect. We will uncover the truth today." The testimonies started one by one. Witnesses came forward, shedding light on the mismanagement and corruption within the VA system. The stories were heartbreaking. Veterans like John, who had been promised benefits, only to have them taken away or denied because of bureaucratic errors, incompetence, or simple indifference. Then it was John's turn. His voice, though quiet at first, grew stronger as he recounted his experiences. He spoke of his wife's death, the misdiagnosis, the years spent in the streets, invisible to a country he had given everything to protect. His eyes occasionally flicked over to the panel, but he kept his focus on the truth he told them about the night he saved lives, about how he'd never asked for recognition, but how, despite his sacrifice, he had been forgotten. As John's story unfolded, the weight of his words hit like a wave. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for every veteran who had been forgotten, overlooked, or ignored. The room was silent, the lawmakers listening intently, their faces reflecting shock and guilt. Colonel Mason, who had sat silently until now, stood up to speak. "Mr. Harris saved my life in Fallujah." He said, his voice firm and unwavering, not just mine, but the lives of countless others, and yet the country that he fought for failed him. This is a systemic issue that must be addressed. As Mason's words echoed in the room, something changed. The lawmakers, who had been distant and impartial, now showed signs of concern. The faces of the VA representatives shifted from defensiveness to recognition. Finally, the truth was out. When the hearing concluded, the room broke into murmurs of agreement. The change was inevitable, but the final vote had yet to be cast. As John sat there, the weight of everything he had fought for pressing on him, he knew that no matter the outcome, something had already shifted. But as the session came to an end, Congressman Larson approached him with a quiet nod. "We're making the changes you've been asking for," he said, "but there's still one thing left to do." John's heart pounded. He had fought for so long, but what could this final piece mean? What was Larson talking about? And with that, the room fell silent as the final chapter of John's long journey was about to unfold. As John Harris left the courtroom that day, the weight of the years, the heartache, and the struggle felt lighter. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen, truly seen. The world around him was no longer just a blur of apathy and indifference. It was a world that was starting to listen, and for that, he was thankful. Walking out into the bright afternoon sun, he felt a sense of hope that things were finally changing. But more importantly, he realized that the battle was not over. It was only just beginning. As John passed through the doors, Congressman Larson stopped him with a handshake and a smile. "We'll make sure this never happens again," Larson promised. "Your story won't just be a story. It'll be the start of something bigger, a movement." John nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never asked for this kind of recognition. All he had wanted was respect, acknowledgment, and justice for those who had stood beside him in battle. But now, as his story resonated across the country, he knew he was not alone anymore. This is not just John's story. It's the story of every soldier, every veteran who has been left behind, forgotten in the shadows. If you believe in honoring these brave men and women, if you believe that justice should never be delayed, join the movement. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think our veterans are getting the respect and care they deserve? We want to hear your opinions. Don't forget to subscribe to Tales of the Soldier for more inspiring stories of sacrifice, courage, and honor. Hit that like button to show your support for those who fought for our freedoms. Together we can make sure that the stories of our heroes are never forgotten. Thank you for being part of this journey. Never forget.